Hi there, this is Max from Iridescent Color, and today I've got another free DCTL for you, which is an essential tool that I think you should really have when building your own looks. And the DCTL today is a test image generator, and this is just a collection of different test images that I'm always using when I'm evaluating my own tools and my own looks to verify that I'm not breaking the image and get a good idea of what it is that I'm actually doing. So let's dive straight into all the different test images we can generate and how they can be used. So the first one we see here is a typical hue sweep from left to right, and it has a luminance sweep from bottom to top as well. What we can use this for example, is if I get up the vector scope here and we do something like a hue curve, we can very quickly verify what we are doing, and we can see if we're creating hue folds, for example, here. If you want to know more about hue folds, please make sure to check out my last two videos about Iris Hue Pro version 2, where I go in depth about why hue folds are a problem and how you can avoid them. But this is one thing that we can use this particular test chart for, to really get a good visualization in the vector scope of what we're doing with our hue adjustments, for example. So the next one is a simple gray ramp, and this can be super helpful in a lot of cases. For example, here I've got a compound node called print. This is both my look and my DRT. This is my entire display rendering transform, and it looks like this. And now if I get up my waveform here, this ramp really allows us to see what the entire system is doing to our gray ramp. We can see that we have a slightly raised black point here. We can also see very well that this DRT, or this print in this case, has a non-standard white point. So we've got a creative white point going on, which is really just a result of my split tone DCTL, which is my Split Tone Pro version 2 DCTL, which has this feature that I can use it after the DRT to get this nice convergence at the top to get a non-standard creative white point. And this is something that's very easy to evaluate when I just generate a gray ramp at the start of my node graph. You can see that my test charts are always living just before all of my look and DRT nodes here. The next image we have is similar, and this is an exposure chart. And the great thing about this one is that it's color space aware. So you've got all these different color spaces, and this exposure chart essentially creates different patches for exposure stops. You can use this step slider here to decide how many you want. If you have 3, then you've got middle gray in the middle, and then to the left and to the right you've got 1 stop above and below middle gray, and that is in photometric stops according to the color space that you've selected down here. And the great thing is this really allows you to verify what your look is doing. I'm just going to turn off the split tone for now because it makes it a bit harder to see. But now we can see our entire image formation system. We can see our look, so the creative tone curve, but we can also see the tone curve that our DRT is adding. And what this allows us to verify is how many stops of dynamic range we're preserving throughout our entire system. So you can see I've got a tone curve going on, and I can turn it on and off, and I've got a DRT going on, which I can turn on and off, and both of these obviously have an effect on the rendering of tonality in the image, and this helps us just really count how many stops of dynamic range we're still preserving once our image is prepared for display. The next one is just a middle gray patch, and this can be really helpful to verify that things like your look adjustments here, I can turn off everything else for now, that my look adjustments here are not affecting middle gray, which they don't, because I'm using iridescent color tools, which are all color space aware, to make sure that that is not the case. But now if I turn all of this on again, what I can also use this for is if I want to create some kind of custom tone curve and I want to create an anchor point at middle gray, I can just have this generate middle gray for me and drop an anchor point here, and now I should be able to create any curve I want without affecting middle gray. The problem is that Resolve isn't really super precise with these anchor points. So you can see we still get I don't know if you can see it, but I can see that there's a slight shift in middle gray regardless. But still, this is close enough, and we can use this to do things like this, where we just create an anchor point to make sure that we anchor middle gray in our curves, for example. The next one are these ramps, and I'm going to turn the print off for now. These ramps can be really useful, for example, if you use something like the film look creator, or you're trying different methods for adding halation and bloom. This gives you a great overview of all the different levels of contrast you can find in your image. Here you can see something very bright against something very dark will create a strong halation effect in this particular case, whereas these medium contrast areas will not create that much. And this is a very easy way to compare different methods of halation and bloom to see how they operate and which ones you prefer. By the way, I want to quickly shout out my friend Lenz, who's got a great YouTube channel which is all about learning color grading in a very simple and digestible way, and it's also platform independent. So he teaches you principles that will apply to Final Cut Pro, to DaVinci Resolve, or whatever else you use. This DCTL is also inspired by a resource that he offers on his website, especially for users of Final Cut Pro. It's also a collection of different test images very similar to these. So if you're not a DaVinci Resolve Studio user and you still want test images like this, make sure to check out Eric's website and make sure to leave him a subscription on YouTube as well. Then we've got this one, which I've called Color Slices. This is inspired by a tool called RGB Chips by Thatcher Freeman. And this one is really crucial when you're choosing which DRT to use. And I'm going to explain why. So what's happening if I turn on my print here is you can see we're really getting a big change in the image. And what we're seeing here in this case, this is OpenDRT that I'm using as my DRT. It has something called purity compression, which is the way that highlights desaturate as we climb up to these very high purity colors. So if I turn this off again, you can see we're going all the way up to super pure red, super pure blue and green, and so on. And once I turn on this DRT, they are all sort of desaturating towards white. They're all compressing towards white. And this is really important to create a pleasing image. If you think about Star Wars, for example, and you see the lightsabers, this is what film does automatically, which is that we have the core of a really bright light source, whatever the color is, will always compress towards white to give us a sense of the intensity. And this is really important to create pleasing images. It's very easy to see on an image like this, for example. So this is what OpenDRT looks like, and you can see that we get a really pleasing rendering of all of these very high purity neon lights, etc. But if I turn OpenDRT off and turn on the color space transform and resolve, you can see how much worse this looks straight away. This is a very different look than this. You can see that we get really strange colors, very digital and garish looking colors here in these neon lights. And it's even easier to see when we go back and turn on this test chart. You see we get none of this purity compression. These colors just stay very intense, and we lose a lot of detail, and we lose all sense of intensity and lightness of these colors, which a good DRT like OpenDRT, for example, will always preserve. But there's obviously different options. We've got 2499 here, which you can see has some of that purity compression, but in a different way. But still, we can very quickly see that this is giving us a rendering of our image where all of these gradations are preserved, and we're getting a brighter image as we climb up the tone scale, and we get some of this compression, which we don't get with the CST and Resolve. And that is really important. So from looking at this test chart, it's usually very easy to judge how an image is going to look once we turn off this test chart. With 2499, for example, we get more color in these neon lights and not such a strong sense of compression. And that's exactly what we're seeing when we turn on the test chart. But if we go back to OpenDRT now, you can see we get a lot more of this compression, and the neon lights are a lot whiter and more desaturated, which is exactly what we see when we turn on this test chart. And so this test chart can really help us get a good idea of how a DRT operates and if it is a good and solid DRT. We can also use the step slider here to adjust how many different slices of color we want to see in this chart. And another thing we can do with this, is if we get up the vector scope again, you can see these loops that we see here. And this is another really great indicator of a good DRT, is that as we climb up the purity, what happens is we reach a kind of maximum purity point. And at that point, we get a little bit of a hue shift, and then we turn around and compress towards white. And we can see this in OpenDRT very well. The reds, for example, they bend towards yellow as we climb up the tone scale or as we climb up purity here. And then they compress to white. And this is what these loops indicate. And we can see a very similar thing in 2499. We get these loops, and these are an indicator of a good DRT, whereas this, which is the Resolve CST, is a very good indicator of a bad DRT. And even if I turn on saturation compression, you can see this doesn't help much. It doesn't really help much with a pleasing rendering of the image. It just doesn't look very good. And I don't want to go too much into DRTs, but I just want to demonstrate this so that you have an understanding of why this specific test chart is very, very important and very useful. Okay, and our last one is another one that is inspired by a Thatcher Freeman tool. This is a gradient smoothness chart. Essentially what we get here is an 180-degree gradient between two hues, and we can adjust the base hue by using the slider here. And this can really help us understand if the tools that we are using create any problems with smooth gradients. And the Film Look Creator is another great example to demonstrate this. I don't want to dunk on it too much, but if I go back and go to Clean Slate and then start blending in some Film Look, for example, and do something like a split tone and use some of these sliders like the richness slider and the subtractive sat slider, and then I use a different base hue here, we can very quickly see there are combinations of these sliders that create huge problems in the smoothness of these gradients. And that will definitely have an impact on our image if we find colors like this in our image. And that's always a good indicator that something about the tool that we're using is maybe not ideal and is causing problems in the image. Because ideally, when we have a gradient in the image, we want that gradient to stay smooth throughout our entire system. If I turn this off and turn on my entire print pipeline, you can see we get a lot of contrast, obviously, from the DRT, etc. But more or less, the gradients remain smooth, and that's because OpenDRT, for example, is just a good DRT. And even if I turn this off, you can see that all the iridescent color tools that I'm using here are not creating any smoothness issues in these gradients. And that's something we can verify very, very quickly and very effectively with this last gradient smoothness generator. And that was an overview over all the different test images in this DCTL. I hope you find this helpful. I hope this gives you a good idea of how you can quality test your own looks and your own DRTs. And this tool is absolutely free. You can head to my website now to get it for free. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to my newsletter to make sure that you stay informed about new free tools like this. And I thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again very, very soon.